All right, instant live reaction for the Eagles Packers. And unfortunately, what was looking like a pretty straightforward recap with a lot to talk about turns into a very unfortunate circumstance and turn of events at the end of the game with the Jordan Love injury. I'm not ever going to use these recap shows to speculate on injuries. We'll leave that to the official teams and the reports. Did not look good at the end of it based on how much pain he was in as he went down. So that's a status, obviously, incredibly impactful to the entire league and especially the NFC going forward. So we have to wait and see what we're getting from that. But I think I'm going to start on the other side of the football and kind of talk about what we're getting from the Eagles going forward, because to me, that is where I was going to go with this recap and reaction and just talk about what I saw from Philadelphia, which gives me a lot of confidence in what I have as an Eagles team making the Super Bowl against the Kansas City Chiefs in my preseason predictions. So for all of you who are joining in for the recap, would love to have you drop your comments on the YouTube side if you think anything from the game. Curious to know what you thought, and I'll get to those in just a second. So as I titled the video, the Eagles offense make them a legitimate Super Bowl contender. And to me, that was the big takeaway from this game on the Philadelphia side of the football. When I sat down to watch the game, I obviously have been quite vocal, doing a lot of media about having the Eagles represent the NFC in the Super Bowl. And this is a massive game for them. And it was one of 4 tests that they have on the schedule before Thanksgiving. And so when the game started the way it did with the fumble and the interception, and you can kind of see the sideline with Jalen Hurts getting in the face of some guys, I was like, oh no, this is the end of last year carrying over into this year. And I could see it just on the brink of unraveling. And then what we saw the rest of the game was this Eagles team with the talent that they have now, with adult and real legitimate coordinators on offense and defense. Last year at the end of the year, this team flat out quit. And we saw performances that started off like the Eagles started off today, never recover. There was never a bounce back anywhere in any of those games. It just started bad and got worse. And today started bad. And the fact that we're able to overcome it was massive. And when I talk about the options that the Eagles now have on the team, we saw them really tested, which what gave them problems in the games last year where they started to quit. Jalen Hurts and this Eagles offense had no answer whatsoever for the blitz. Teams were blitzing him at will, and there was no changeup. There was no counterpunch. Today, the Packers with Jeff Hafley started the game blitzing Jalen Hurts and this Eagles team like crazy. They were testing the new offensive line. They were testing the new center, putting a big test on them up front with extra pressure. And we saw the Eagles start the game struggling with it. Fast forward into the second quarter, they adjusted because now there's an outlet in Saquon Barkley. We saw Jalen Hurts taking extra command at the line of scrimmage, changing up the plays. Yes, it was probably forced later in the snap clock than Kellen Moore would prefer for an offense that moves at the pace that he does. But the command that Hurts had at the line to change those plays and either find Barkley or Gainwell in some of the 2-minute drives when he was in, and move A.J. Brown around and get that involved, it just shows the options that this Eagles team has this year and the willingness to change when things aren't going well that they can overcome, that I think is incredibly promising for this team. Saquon Barkley looks like the guy that we saw in his first season with the New York Giants. That burst is real, and his ability in the passing game is real. It looks like a completely different player than what we saw recently, and is an example of what it can look like when you're put in such a better situation. And this game really, like, we didn't see Dallas Goedert get going, which is the guy that's really going to be leaned on when defenses go to a lot of cover 2, which is something the Eagles didn't have an answer for last year a lot of the time, that they will have an answer for this year. And I think even in a game like this, where it was clear Jalen Hurts wanted to get outside of the pocket and run, and that wasn't working either. And the fact that they were able to shift and still make it work, to me, is very promising for what you're going to get from the Eagles going forward. Now, defensively, you can see where there's growth needed. Avonte Maddox can't be in the slot. Get him out of there. You had Quinion Mitchell in that position all offseason, all camp. I know he's a rookie. I think it was just overthinking things with the Rodgers injury and moving him around. Maddox is a liability in the slot. Fangio's going to figure that out. This young group of defensive backs is something that I think will improve during the course of the year. They were tested in a big way today. But I look at what the Packers did for 4 quarters. It was a very inaccurate Jordan Love. It was a defense that was tested with some very bad field position, some very bad situations, and they bent, but they did not break. And that, to me, says a lot about a very young defense on the back half going up against a very good offense. And so, to me, that's another promising side on the defensive side of the football. And like a lot of people watching this stream, I think fairly would have the Packers as possibly their representative of the NFC. Like, this was no joke of a game for the Eagles. This was a massive test. And despite failing it just dramatically early, they're able to overcome it on both sides of the football. And I thought put forth an effort that it was messy, it was clunky at times, but still, I think shows what the Eagles' trajectory can be this season. Now, the bad part of this and the ugly side of it was obviously some Hurts decision-making late in the game on that drive where he throws across his body to try find A.J. Brown into traffic and gets picked off. I thought at times the Eagles got a little bit run heavy. They started a lot of drives this game with a run, which is great at times, but when you needed it late, they went to it on the final drive, but it's almost like they waited a little bit longer than they needed to go to that run game. I would have liked to see that heavy run a little bit earlier on that drive prior in the fourth quarter. It reminds me a lot of the Thursday night week 2 game last year where the Eagles had a big lead, ended up rattling off a 9.5-minute drive. This to me felt like that Eagles team with Sirianni going to that run heavy look late in the game that we saw work so well for them last year. So I think it's something with Barkley and that improvement that we're going to really see kind of improve as the season goes on. So to me, that was a big win. If you're an Eagles fan, it's a big win. If you have Eagles NFC futures and you look at the schedule for Philadelphia, I mean, there's 3 tests for them now through Thanksgiving. Otherwise, they're going to be in games. They're going to be favored to win. I think it's an Eagles team that can really get better as the season progresses. Lots of comments. Appreciate it very much. We'll get to the Packers side in a second, but I just want to catch up with what is going on. The teasers for Green Bay. I'm sure people were sweating those in the chat as well. Davis Sanchez in from the panel. Is that a button-up shirt? Really classing things up on this game night. I'm trying my best. We've got the nice background. We're trying to soften things up. 3 buttons, goes a little bit, the blade collar. I'm trying my best. I don't have the suit budget that you were allocated and you were able to pull off, but I'm doing my best here on this side. Tripp says Barkley is unleashed with the Eagles. Yes, I mean, that was really, really good. And how he's involved and how he's going to be used, I think we're just seeing a bit of the surface with this. Preston said Hurts looked a little bit rusty. I thought both sides had a lot of rust. I thought there was just between him and the center in the exchange, we saw that the tush push is not going to be the same without Kelsey. We saw the communication issues. It's another thing that you're going to get right, most likely over time. And I think to this point about the rust, they obviously didn't play in the preseason. What was interesting about the Eagles preseason is Nick Sirianni had a press conference week 2. He was talking about how their preseason plans were disrupted because typically they have a big joint practice with the Ravens to get a lot of these things right, but they couldn't do it to the extent they wanted because they play each other this season. And then they had the travel spot in week 2. They had weather in both games that impacted how they could play starters. They also had a shorter week in preseason. So it was kind of a clunky preseason where it's now, before they snapped the ball tonight, it was 3 weeks where guys weren't on the field for the Eagles at full game speed. And so I think that certainly stood out to me a little bit. Interesting comment here. Is it just me or does Hurts not look explosive at all? Hardly ever made a man miss and could only run guys over once he had a full head of steam. So I thought the Packers defended him very well. I thought the discipline out on the edges for Green Bay was really strong all game to really contain Hurts and him getting outside, really until the last drive when Hurts really started to extend plays out of the pocket and was holding on to the ball for a long time where he was bowling guys over, like you mentioned. Did we really see him kind of break out and look like the runner in the open field that we've seen? But his stat line for the end of the day, 13 carries for 33 yards. I thought that was a good job of what the Packers defense did. What I did notice was his shoes did not change over the course of the game. So in the first half, a lot of slippage. I'll talk about the field stuff in a second, but a lot of guys were slipping. Halftime came, and I thought coming out of half, there was a lot less of it, and guys were adjusting to it. It didn't seem like Hurts ever changed. And so that was perhaps limiting what he could potentially do. So that was maybe something that played into that a little bit, but certainly that's a lot of credit to the Packers defense and how well they defended him. I think when we see the Eagles against teams that elect to go to those cover 2 looks and drop 2 high safeties, we're going to see his legs look as good as they ever have been now that he is back fully healthy. Andrew says, enjoying the live recaps. Enjoying having you here, Andrew. Hopefully everyone else is sharing the same sentiment as well. The Lord MCD says, was the late field goal evidence of awareness of the spread? Wouldn't you rather be up by 2 and make your opponent with no timeouts drive the entire field versus up 5 and they get a kickoff? Not necessarily, given that time and the clock, because you're then forcing the touchdown and you know what you have to defend. I know it's a longer field, as you'd probably need about 60 yards, whereas if you would have kicked the touchback, which was, by the way, the Packers special teams not fixed to bring that out of the end zone, but that's still an ongoing issue. But no, I would rather have the cushion rather than defend the goal line than I would defend the field goal. So that to me is the right decision that they made. Couple other questions. So Ben says Hurts was also running cautious on that field. I think that's an interesting comment and kind of takes me over to the Packers side of things. So when I was talking about Hurts and he didn't switch and he looked like the same quarterback mobility-wise all game, I point to Josh Jacobs. That was a guy that couldn't get any burst or any cut whatsoever, that in the second half looked like a completely different running back. And you'll notice the shoe change that he went through. So I think it was interesting to me how the Packers and the Eagles have this exact same surface in both of their home stadiums, same grass turf hybrid, same company, same surface. And early in the game, you were hearing how they were talking about the equipment staff being unprepared for what they were getting into. Now, J.J. Watt had a really good tweet talking about how the surface changes between a soccer stadium and a NFL football stadium. I did my best to try to figure out why, because I'm legitimately interested. I don't know why the same grass and same turf and same surface from the same company that's the same hybrid would act so differently between 3 stadiums. I tried to get the answer. I didn't get a concrete one. J.J. Watt said it's because soccer fields are meant for more speed and finesse. Many times you saw a lot of speed and finesse from Reed, and later in the game, Jacobs and Devonta Smith, like those guys were having no problems getting around on the turf. Whereas then you saw some of the bigger guys, and a guy like Hurts that's a more kind of grounded runner and heavier at the bottom was having a lot of trouble getting a lot of traction on the edge. And so that was maybe interesting, but I don't know why it would be so different. I handicapping the game with the over, part of why I liked the over was because I expected the surface to be the same and there to be familiarity, but it clearly was an impact on the field in Brazil. So that certainly, I think, impacted things. And it kind of brings me to Jordan Love, which is my last point on the game. As we saw the Packers offense, I mean, it didn't look good at really any point. They had big plays, but when I look at some of the advanced numbers for the Packers offense in this game, very boomer bust, similar to what we saw in the first half of last season. They had an EPA per play in this game that was 71st percentile, but they had a success rate that was 25th percentile. And so anytime you see a big difference between the EPA per play and the success rate, it's boom or bust one way or the other. You're either getting a few plays to go for very big numbers, but not a lot of sustained drives and success, or you're doing it the other way where you're having a lot of sustained success, but you're not capitalizing on those big plays to score points. And we saw Jordan Love 17 of 34. And again, like, I don't want to speculate on the injury that he suffered and where this might go, but it was hard not to ignore, as I'm watching this game, how his back plant foot on so many different dropbacks was just slipping a little bit. And he was very uncomfortable in the pocket. Feet were moving. He was trying to get outside the pocket, I thought, much too quickly. Never looked comfortable. Never really looked settled in the pocket either. 17 of 34, but 260 yards and 2 touchdowns. And so I can't help but wonder, as we're talking about the surface and being conservative and the cleats and everything that went into this, how much that might have impacted Jordan Love. As the game went on, we heard that there was a calf injury, or cramps rather, that was lingering and potentially bothering him too. Was that spurred on by the field conditions and the slipping in the pocket? I don't know. And so that was an interesting factor there, but certainly hoping that the injury is not anywhere as severe as what it looked, because the NFL and all of us as fans and all of us as bettors need Jordan Love to be there to make the NFC and the league as entertaining as it is. So I hopefully we all get good news on that injury and we can continue watching him play in the season and it's not something serious going forward. So what's your snap adjustment to the Packers if Love has to miss an extended amount of time? I think it's a great question. I don't know, like, if they stick with Willis, at least a touchdown. I'd say 7.5, 8. I mean, you're not getting much at all out of Malik Willis, and you're really then relying on the offensive line of Green Bay, which is it is the weakness of this team right now. To go from this offense that has so much depth at wide receiver and creative play calling that Matt LaFleur can implement, to take Love out of the equation, go to Malik Willis would just be devastating for any amount of time. And so it'd be a massive adjustment for the Green Bay Packers, no question, if this is a long-term injury. Jason agrees with me, at least the TD going to Willis. It is. I don't know if they've released him or what the status of Sean Clifford is. Was very boom or bust in camp against backups with picks and turnovers. I'd almost prefer someone like him that's a willing thrower than rather like Malik Willis at the end of the game, not throwing a Hail Mary and getting sacked. It was like the most on-brand thing for Malik Willis, who got benched in a preseason game by Mike Vrabel, not because he was making bad plays, but because he was literally not throwing the football. Followed it up with a very good preseason last year, but a significant downgrade for the Packers going forward. Devin Barth has a question. Any concerns about the Eagles or Packers D, or was tonight more of an example of how good these offenses were? Very few stops tonight. So it's an ongoing thing right now in week one. Defensive coordinators, in my prediction, before Thursday, were going to struggle. We've seen 3 new defensive coordinators make their debut so far this season. Last night, Zach Orr and his defense gave up 27 to Kansas City. And then tonight we saw both coordinators give up either 34 or 29 points. And this is a trend and something we've seen since the preseason change in 2021, where defensive coordinators debuting against top 10 offenses at the end of the year concede on average 31 points per game. And that's what happens in their debut. And so the next one up is going to be Ryan Nielsen on Sunday against the Miami Dolphins, which is a massive test. But so far we've seen 3 DC and scheme changes, and we've seen 3 offenses have a ton of success against them. It's just really tall asks for these defenses with the new coordinators and with significant scheme adjustments to get right against good offenses this early and hit the ground running. If you put me on the spot right now and say, what makes you more optimistic, the Packers defense or the Eagles defense? I would say right now it's the Eagles defense. I see more potential for them to improve developing that youth than I do with the Packers. I thought it was concerning. I thought it was a good thing at first that Jair Alexander was allowed to travel, something that rarely happened in the Joe Barry system. Now he was allowed to travel, was with A.J. Brown for a ton of snaps. But again, in that matchup, he was losing a lot. How much of that was just new scheme? How much of that was potentially the field conditions where A.J. Brown had the advantage out of cuts and things like that? Hard to say off the start, but to me, what the Eagles did defensively was more promising than what we see from the Green Bay Packers. So the NFC gets very, very interesting. Happy for the sake of my prediction of the Eagles Super Bowl run that they were able to look like they did tonight and get the win despite some of the struggles. Thought the overcoming of those issues just shows that this team is potentially taking the next step forward in maturity. And we get the 2 main NFC contenders now coming up on Sunday Night Football. And then Monday Night Football with the Rams and the Lions. I'm not quite putting the Rams in that mix yet as they go through some massive changes on defense without Aaron Donald and the loss of a key corner. So we get to see the other 2 top contenders, at least with these 2 teams, assuming Love is healthy, the next primetime games coming up, which will be the next time I am back with a recap and reaction video. That's not true. I'll be back after the Sunday afternoon games at 4 p.m. conclude. But I'll also be back here on the RAS Picks YouTube channel tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Pacific and Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific. Both days, 8 a.m. Pacific. College football release show tomorrow morning at 8. NFL release show Sunday morning at 8. So if you have not yet subscribed and you're enjoying the reaction content, the podcast content, the preview content, we got NFL and college football previews up. Subscribe button is down below. Appreciate a thumbs up as well. Hopefully you guys have a fantastic Friday evening. We'll chat to you tomorrow here on the channel at 8 a.m.